The toll hyper-criminalization has on society. Martin Luther King's words exemplifies a greater meaning to the word criminal that our current society has altered in an African American affiliated term. In this essay, I will discuss how King viewed the police and their actions against protesters, and how mass incarceration was based on racial profiling, and how it played a role in the law enforcement that goes about the view of what a criminal is viewed. I will also explore how the increased number of cases of gun violence has brought about protests that are similar to the way King believed to solve the problems of racial inequality. My question will be to circumference with arguments from both sides. Has the fight for racial equality ended on a basis of criminalization and racial profiling? I argue King would view the criminalization of black Americans in our current day and age is similar to the events that occurred during his rise to power. The question if King's dream really came true, referencing his speech, is shown how we still face a constant battle of racial inequality. His idea of non-violence has played a significant role in how protests have gone to attempt to fend racial tensions that are omnipresent in the 21st century. Mass incarceration, explained by Joseph Mistola.
Hi, so the first question I'm responding to asks, Martin Luther King's words exemplifies a greater meaning to the word criminal that our current society has altered in an African American affiliated term. What would Martin Luther King say about how mass incarceration has affected the African American community and racial profiling that has caused this problem? Martin Luther King said in the letter of Birmingham, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Explain if he was alive how he would react not only to the government but to people. So my stance on this question is that when African Americans were given their civil rights in the 1960s, they were legally given a chance to strive and become successful in American society. However, there was and there still is this deep-rooted African American culture that I feel it was kind of hard for that culture to adapt to American society. There are a lot of African Americans who have strived and become very successful in life. I mean, there are plenty of athletes that are African Americans, plenty of politicians. There's an African American president, and Barack Obama. And I think that, although there have been a lot of people that have been successful, there's still a lot of people that have been left behind and they haven't been given the chance to strive and become successful in life. So, they've just been, they've resorted to, ruining their, the image of their community by, committing crimes and by, just not following the law. And this has contributed to this image or this racial profiling of African Americans. And I feel that Martin Luther King would respond to this by saying that although there are people that have been successful, there's a lot of people that need help. The African American community still needs justice. They need to be seen the same way as other races in America. And I think that he would push for African Americans to have more justice in this country, and push for further rights and for further acknowledgement and appreciation of them. I think that additionally, the way that African Americans are racially profiled can be by education and how maybe their the reading and the test scores of African American students aren't as high as other races. So I think that he would strive to educate the younger and try to help the older African Americans assimilate better and to find productive ways to impact American society and not be racially profiled and seen as criminals just because that's what the rest of their race is categorized as. I don't think that it's fair, and I don't think that Martin Luther King would think that's fair as well. I think that also he would strive to educate, to feed, and provide opportunities for those who cannot easily access these things, access things that allow other races to succeed and to not be racially profiled as criminals. I think that he would be upset with the fact that 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 law enforcement and just people across the country have shifted their hatred for African Americans, just like a natural hatred to a discrimination in in the justice system, that African Americans may get harsher punishments than whites, Caucasians, for a similar crime. I think that he would fight for equality in that sense. Additionally, I think that Martin Luther King would strive to to teach criminals, people that are already incarcerated. I think that he would strive to teach them how to become productive and to impact their families' lives and to just be better presences in American society. I feel that a lot of people that are incarcerated, they've just been in the wrong, they've just been involved with the wrong things at the wrong times. I'm sure maybe if that person grew up in a better community, that they wouldn't have gotten involved in drugs and just getting in issues with the law. So I think that one thing that he would do is strive to rebuild the reputation of African Americans. He would teach them how to succeed and live positive lives, and rather than being left to die in jail, or just getting released from jail and then committing the same crime once they get out. I think that he wants everybody to succeed and be happy in America, all races, and his involvement with the civil rights movement was primarily with African Americans. I feel if it was any other race, he would probably feel the same way, and I just think that he would have a similar stance, maybe a more modern stance with the times, but I think that his overall mindset and objectives would be very similar to his objectives during the 1960s, during the civil rights movement.
Mass incarceration, explained by Daniel Corridon.
Martin Luther King's words exemplify a greater meaning to the word criminal that our current society has altered in an African American affiliated term. What would Martin Luther King say about how mass incarceration has affected the African American community and how racial profiling that has caused this problem? Martin Luther King said in the letter of Birmingham, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Explain, if he was alive, how he would react to not only the government but to the people. I think if Martin Luther King Jr. was alive today, he would be talking about how detrimental an effect mass incarceration has on the African American community and how racial profiling and racism amongst people of our country has contributed to it. And I think it's very obvious because the rates of African Americans incarceration are so much higher than for any other race. And I think it's rooted in racism that's been around for decades, and it's present in different policies in different places. Like in New York City, you had the stop and frisk policy where cops could stop people on the street and frisk them for no matter what. And it eventually led to a lot of arrests of black people for non-violent crimes like drug possession. And so these people are getting locked up and put away for minor crimes that they were unfairly targeted for. And I think it's rooted in just the systematic racism that's present, and this goes to the people themselves, because it's not only the government policy, it's the people who spread these ideas and beliefs, because simple things like people even making racist jokes and like teasing black people, calling them criminals, because subconsciously then it becomes part of our society and it just affects how everyone views African Americans. Michelle Alexander said in her book, The New Jim Crow, words that King would have possibly used if he was still alive today. Through her words, how would King react? What issues would he tackle, and how would he use his power to alter the situation? And the words are as follows. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt, so we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are all suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. I think these words that Michelle Alexander uses are very accurate and close to what Martin Luther King Jr. would have said if he was alive today. And the words are correct, because you can't be openly racist in public like you could back in the 50s and the early 60s, but you can call people criminals and punks like a lot of African American people have been labeled on TV. You hear them called punks very often instead of the N-word, and that's probably a modern, toned-down version of discriminating against them. And it's true that a lot of criminals are denied lots of rights and liberties when they get released from jail. And it is unfair, because the point of a jail sentence is to try and heal someone and give them a second chance. So you're supposed to make them better and cure them of their disease or whatever you think criminalness is. And so you're supposed to rehabilitate them. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. And so once someone has served their sentence, they should be treated like a normal citizen again, and they're not. And it's just unfair, because these people are then introduced back into our society and they're just considered inferior to everyone else. And it's tough for them to ever get back on the same playing field, which I don't think they ever can.
Mass incarceration, explained by Diego Arlano.
I think Martin Luther King Jr. would be extremely disappointed in the direction that the United States has taken in the past couple of years, especially with the ideas of mass incarceration and racial profiling. For instance, I think he would be extremely disappointed in the idea that our current police systems in many different cities around the country are becoming extremely biased and putting stereotypes and having extreme discrimination against especially African American communities. I think he would also see this in the sense of the quote that was used, that this is a common trend not just in the African American community but in other communities. For instance, we'll take the Hispanic community here in the United States and the idea of stereotypes of being undocumented and things like that. I think he would be extremely disappointed in that. And in terms of government, he would obviously be disappointed in the current administration. I mean, the current administration has decredited and said the Black Lives Movement is similar to that of a terrorist organization, but I completely think that in some terms, the Black Lives Matter movement stems off of Martin Luther King's ideas and fundamental mission. So, yeah. if Martin Luther King were alive today, I think the world would be an extremely different place. I mean, he would use his power, and his power would be within his word. So in his way to, I mean, what he did before, everything that he said was powerful and influencing. It was the way that he spoke and the way that he was able to spark sort of a spark and influence into certain people. So I definitely understand that aspect. I think Michelle Alexander in her book definitely talked about the idea of a new type of Jim Crow, and I completely agree with that. I think Martin Luther King would also, I think her words are extremely accurate, and the idea that now saying being a racist, people would not identify as that, but people will identify with saying things such as, African Americans are more likely to go into prison, or some sort of discriminatory statements as that. So I do understand where she's coming from, and I do think Martin Luther King would agree with her in that sense and say things like that. But I think the power that he has is definitely in his word. So he would use that, and I mean, if he was alive today, it'd be entirely different situations that we'd be in now, government administration-wise, civil rights-wise, in many different communities, not just in the African American community, but I think especially in minority communities like the LGBT community, the Hispanic community, and things like that.
Police Brutality, explained by Robbie Bartels.
If MLK were alive now and saw all the issues with police brutality and the way black men and women are being treated across this country now compared to how he saw his own people being treated during the civil rights movement, he would be just as inspired and just as eloquent in how he speaks to people. He could orate. He's a great orator, and he would be able to make sense to a lot of people, because there's not someone in our modern day who has been able to bring together people and speak to them on a large scale and make sense to them and say things in such a beautiful way that they convey just a clarity like his speeches did, his letters to Birmingham, his I Have a Dream speech. We need that stuff now. They're inspirational, and they give guidance to people. At the same time, he can also, if he were alive, he could be a great mediator between the people of this nation who are protesting to the federal government and get our agenda as the citizens of America to the government and make sense to the government and hold officials accountable for fixing these problems. He could do exactly that, and that's what he would be inspired to do and love to do if he were alive. Martin Luther King is right when he says we can never be satisfied if the Negro is still a victim to police brutality, because we need to, as a country, understand that the same safety that some of our most privileged citizens have should extend to every citizen, every background, every race, every gender, and every form of human being. It feels like the media doesn't really help at all. It doesn't feel like they are reporting. It feels like they are sensationalizing the accounts of people being murdered in the streets by police and being treated like second-class citizens, really. The media is it's bombarding people with these images, and after a while, doing that makes people think that that's normal. It normalizes it. It makes people feel bored by these things, and then they just accept that it happens, and that's horrible, because we need to not be comfortable with it. We need to be angry about this stuff, because it's our fellow citizens being hurt, being oppressed, being treated like these second-class citizens, and being killed in the streets, and we need to demand from our authorities and from our government officials that someone does something about this, and the media needs to do their job and report real information and do stories on what leads to these kind of environments in these neighborhoods where there's no resources and things go horribly wrong for people, and then the police believe everyone they see on the street is a threat, and then when someone is innocent and then their lives are taken, and then we just accept that happened. We make up excuses instead of demanding change. So yes, we can't be satisfied if the black man is still treated like this in our country. We should be astoundingly angry that this is happening still. We should want this to be a part of our past, not our present or our future. We need to be angry and uncomfortable that this still happens.
Brutality explained by Connor Mathers, but spoken by me to protect his identity. Martin Luther King's words exemplifies a greater meaning to the word criminal that our current society has altered in an African American affiliated term. What would Martin Luther King say about how police brutality has affected the African American community and racial profiling is a huge factor to it? Martin Luther King said in the letter to Birmingham, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of brutality tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Explain, if he was alive, how would he react to not only the government but to the people?" Connor Mathers said, "I believe racial profiling is a problem that fills African Americans with a sense of fear, and the media has caused that. Alleged police um, alleged police brutality has skyrocketed through the use of media. People post videos of cops, quotations, abusing African Americans, but never show why. I do believe racial profiling is a serious problem in African American society, and Martin Luther King would agree. However, I believe he wouldn't accuse officers of police brutality if he hadn't known why the officer was acting that way." In Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream," he stated, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Does this apply to media today? Is it justified? Connor says, "Yes, I agree with this statement. I believe racial profiling is a problem today. Police would tend to pay more attention to a person of African American background rather than one of Caucasian background. The media most definitely plays a role on this. However, I do not think it's a good one. Videos of police officers using harsh force on an African American person seems to go viral almost every day, but those videos never show what the African American does to cause the response from the officer. In other words, no one seems to have uh, phone out recording the crime committed to the abused." This is a mixed argument explained by Vincent Manta. So, Vince, Martin Luther King's words exemplifies a greater meaning to the word criminal that our current society has altered in an African American affiliated term. What would Martin Luther King say about mass incarceration has affected the African American community and racial profiling that has caused this problem? Martin Luther King said in the letter of Birmingham, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Explain, if he was alive, how would he react to the government and to the people?
Can you repeat that last part again?
Explain, if he was alive, how would he react to not only the government but to the people?
So as far as mass incarceration goes and gun violence, I think that mass incarceration is a big byproduct of the war on drugs, which is a problem in the United States that we have to reform a lot of laws, and a lot of those laws unfairly target minority groups, and studies show this. So I think that a big way to solve both gun violence, mass incarceration, and even police brutality is to limit the interactions that police have with minority groups and people in general over nonviolent drug offenses or nonviolent offenses overall. As far as the second part of the question, what would Martin Luther King Jr. say? That's what you asked, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I would think that he would be disappointed with a lot of with both sides, because I think that both sides try to make everything about race, and they don't always look at the context of each person's character. It's like, if something bad happens to a black person immediately, it's because that person was black, and it's not because he might have committed a crime. Like, nobody looks past race only in determining whether somebody's wrong or right. Like, immediately they look at race, and that's what judges the rest of the situation. Everybody jumps to their conclusions from there until there's evidence to prove otherwise.
Okay.
Second. Did that all make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yes. On the basis of police brutality, in Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream," he stated, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Does this apply to media today? Is it justified?
I think that police brutality is a problem all over the spectrum. If you look at reports everywhere where there are incidences of police abusing their power in all walks of life with all different races. But there's also to say that people do sometimes make up police brutality problems. I've spoken to cops who say that every day there's another complaint because somebody thinks that there's a problem. So I think that everybody needs to look at it and say, how do we solve this problem fairly, and how do we look at it in a way that we actually get bad cops off the street? Because I think that if you're a good cop, you should be angry that there are bad cops who abuse their power. So I think that the best way to do it is just for everybody to really make a point to root out bad cops.
Okay. And on the basis of gun violence, Martin Luther King said in the letter of Birmingham, "Justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We caught in an unescapable network of reality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Explain alive today. What would he say?
I think that gun violence are necessary for oneself, but that doesn't mean that there's not a problem because mass shooting seems to happen frequently, and data shows there are problems. Every such thing.
Yes.
Are you mad at this one or not?
No. It's okay.
Okay. As far as gun violence goes, I think that there is a problem that needs to be resolved. There's also the reality that one is a part of American life, and that we do have the Second Amendment, and people do have rights to defend themselves. And also, if you look in cities where there are tremendous gun laws, that's where gun violence starts rampant. I don't really know if there's a good solution to this right now. I think that education is always a big key, and I think it also goes back to the war on drugs, because a lot of gun violence happens in connection with drug violence. So I think that he would be disappointed, especially if you look at cities like Chicago and the gang violence and gun violence that happen there. I think that he would be disappointed.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Yes, you're welcome.
Closing statement to reiterate what Daniel Corridon said, what Joseph Nostola, Diego Orlano, Robbie Bartels, Connor Mathers, and Vincent Manta. Throughout history, Black Americans have been profiled for committing a crime without an actual investigation ever occurring. The principle of innocent until proven guilty is poignant in the 21st century because racial profiling, stop and frisk, mass incarceration, gun violence, and police brutality plays a role in our everyday lives, even if we don't know it. From the increasing population in prisons, because of the principles like the three-strike policy and law and order that has played a role in minor offenders serving harder times than serious offenders. Police brutality is the common thread through our media for the past 2 years because of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is an essential group in keeping awareness of gun violence and police brutality that targets Black Americans. All factors relating back to King's overall message that hasn't truly been answered yet of racial equality, and only time will tell until the day is true. To reiterate what I said in the introduction, has the fight for racial equality ended on a basis of criminalization and racial profiling? Obviously, the fight is not over. Through our media, through our president, through our law enforcement, we can see that race always plays a role in first impressions, in how we view people in our everyday lives, from the way we speak to each other. There's always this basis of race. And through the interviews, we can see that many people objectify against racism, but then again, we all really Caucasian, except Diego, who is Hispanic. We can't really relate to African Americans as they do in their everyday lives, from the looks they get, from how they feel, because we'll never feel that. They always say we are privileged, and yes, we are, just from our race. It doesn't matter what social status we have, it doesn't matter how much money we have. We will always not be better, but be considered better. And hopefully the day where we all are better will soon come. The toll hyper-criminalization has on society has come to an end. I hoped you gained further knowledge on the subject and will look more into the matters that affect us on our daily lives. Thank you for watching, and good night.